Okay, so I probably should come up with something so special.
Okay, Bernard.
Yeah.
Does it?
An actor now.
Then you sing ya.
Cards in flying Fáilte Road, ag Ciarán Mac Giolla Bhéin, and I react Ghaeilge agus pobl and asking if you have the Ghaeilge, that again and George Forbert and Phobal Hartering. The Plé-phainéil Radicach, a Cree Larna Hagiach the Shaw, agus being our Abel, Decolonisation, Socialist, Greewee Pobl Woniha, and one in East, Molly na Ghaeilge, agus Excapu Edges Political and a Chlorabra Dominican Shaw. Marcinda to Luher Uring go well and cast or Intiha, ag Bali Nurch, J or Nye, agus Drastal and Pobl Shaw or Mark Ireland's future and a Malav, Kumai the Scoil Gheimhridh in his ear, Agriha, ag trademark agus left black. Spragshin which particularly Chorashin, agus Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain agri agor le Gríomhaithe Aontaithe Alad in Acha Clay agus Míle Buíochas Astria Lig. Anna Neo and Scoil Shaw and EA and Gilgore Radicach agus Public Conach Socialach Martin O'Kane agus a Wokal Kailula a Spragan Wedge Fos. Nerdur say and I just train you and Douglan and I am Rahmish and I am Hegara or Son the One agus na Bocht Bio Fani Ghaeilge le Faga. Higgis sin bhailann Jesha Hapu Foster Gluiseachtaí agus Gríomhaithe den Acha Clay a bhhailú le chéile and dún Fáiseacht agus a Gomrádaíocht den a chéile chun an céis seo flé agus rinslan a chéile na míorna ibre a tar bono í na lig. It is Paulchul atá géas leis na Scoil Gheimhridh maidir le mór céisna na sochaí inniu ar a Intaithe Airithóide Athlánaí na Ghaeilge Tíhíocht Sláinte agus glór eile faoi scat na Hacma agus na Acha Clay. Is féidir leis na mór céisna seo lig an ascú agus the Ciarán Mac Giolla Bhéin inniu. Just quickly then, I'd like to give you all a warm welcome to Orliath Mhic Leannáin, the youth and community organisation that connects the revival of the Irish language with community regeneration and development in Upper Springfield and the surrounding areas here in West Belfast. Radical politics are at the heart of Leannáin and questions of decolonisation, socialism, grassroots community activism, the importance of youth and political education are frequently on the agenda here. Therefore, it fills us with hope to see that the question of Irish unity is gradually gaining momentum, and the Leannáin community have attended recent Ireland's Future events, as well as others, particularly the Scoil Gheimhridh in this year in the summer organised by Trademark and Left Black. These have been particularly influential in terms of joining the conversation and even organising Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain in solidarity with other brilliant activists. I'd like to thank them all for their help today. Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain, named after the Irish-speaking radical socialist Republican Martin O'Kane, you'll see on the big pop-ups, whose influential words inspired the type of work that goes on here. He said, "We're the most fiercest challenge against the ruling class, against injustice, for and with the most vulnerable and poorest people, may there be the Irish Fáine visible." To that end, we also want to seize the opportunity to bring together left-wing movements and activists in solidarity as comrades to discuss these issues and share with each other the different but not so different daily work we are all doing. Political education is at the centre of Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain, particularly regarding society's major issues today: United Ireland, climate change, Irish language revival, housing, health and much more through the left-wing lens of class politics. We had Janis Varoufakis last night launch our Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain in an inspiring conversation, and it's on our website for anyone that missed it. And without any more delay, I'd like to hand over to Orliath, our chair.
So, G.D. Carja just solitasnim while Cogar just more cree, Horch de Owen, as an Eimear Nic Ionnrachtaigh and Eimear Spraggling Curla Agus Inniu Arnoia Bay and Cade Kanch o Eimear Ciarán agus Edel of a Johnny Play or Cashin Díchoilíniú agus Carason and Díchoilíniú law. So just before we start, I would like to congratulate Owen on putting such an inspiring, amazing event together today with the cast on Exili or New. So I'm here really just to introduce our key speakers, our Iana Gallantin Shaw. So to Miguel Tusakar le Ciarán Mac Giolla Bhéin mar is Ciarán and Díne Sinne. As an trúr agus ag magu, but bhí Ciarán ceann na daltaí na céad daltaí a bhí ag freastal ar man Scoil Firste nuair a thosaigh sé trotha bliain ó shin. So she intach sean. No, all joking aside, I'm going to start with Ciarán. Ciarán obviously is a language activist. Ciarán was born and reared in the Leannáin, Stewartstown area, not far from the Gaeltacht Bóthair. He attended Bunscoil Phobal First Year. And he then went on as one of the first cohorts to Manscoil First Year in the Culturland at the time. So since Ciarán left the Manscoil, he went on to Queen's University. He undertook a degree in Irish. He also undertook a master's, and I can't remember what in. In Irish. Okay, I was going to say Irish.
Surprise.
But from Ciarán basically left his education, and during his time at Queen's, he was heavily involved in the Irish language movement in West Belfast. And he's been there ever since. Obviously, he's a spokesperson for the Dram Jarg. And Glór na Móna are delighted at the minute that Ciarán is back, working in the Phobal after he spent a time as the CEO of Corlin Gaelscoiliachta. He's back to the radical left here in Glór na Móna. So he is the coordinator of Fishing Phobal, which is looking at language planning for West Belfast. So Ciarán, just to start, really the main question is, so what does decolonisation mean for you, or what has it meant for you during your 40 years in this beautiful place?
I don't know if that was an introduction or a roast. Feel slightly attacked here. I suppose Ciarán Mac earlier agus Ciarán Mac Uí agus Chadhain when you listen Scoil Gheimhridh Uí Chadhain. I suppose want to start in terms of decolonisation. The fact that we're given this conversation primarily in English is testament to the power of the colonial process here in Ireland and the process of they'll say Arwa. Unfortunately, we don't have a simultaneous translation with us today, but it's testament to how powerful the colonial process was in Ireland and the destruction of our native language and culture. And it wasn't through choice, it wasn't through people here to decide to give up the language. It was through a calculated process of, as I say, colonial destruction, where the language primarily was the chief target of that. So sometimes this is portrayed as being natural, that there was a natural process by which the more dominant languages or the easier to learn languages somehow emerged through a process of natural selection to be the hyper languages of the world today. But I mean, if you look at them, the dominant languages of the world today just coincidentally happen to mirror the dominant powers of the last couple of hundred years, the dominant colonial powers. So English, Spanish, French are the dominant languages, and increasingly Mandarin and Chinese, which of course mirrors the power relations in the world. So there's no basis on the utility or other ways of the languages. It's about power and where power lies. And within our own families here, and I know Dale's going to be speaking from the Gaeltacht, where that linguistic chain has remained unbroken for thousands of years. In our own context, in my own personal context, I only had to go back to my great-grandparents to find the last native speakers. So you have a linguistic chain stretching thousands of years within my own family, which was only broken with my great-grandparents, who in turn decided not to speak Irish to their kids, as many families did during that time, as colonialism reached its zenith here in Ireland, and this heralded a period of decisive language shift in Ireland, a calamity which was experienced by innumerable indigenous communities across Europe and around the globe at the same time. And as a result of that shift, what we have now is languages are now divided by linguists into 4 categories. And lowest in that pyramid are what are described as peripheral languages, and they make up 98% of the world's languages, but are spoken by only 10% of the world's population. And Michael Krauss, as a famous linguist, he's predicted that the vast majority of those languages, those 98% of the world's languages, are going to be dead by the end of this century without any serious type of intervention. And I think that the destruction of languages and the destruction of diversity at every level of biology and culture has followed in the train of kind of capitalist global expansion. And we're going to be hearing more today. We have a session on ecology and environment. We have a session on environment, or on the economy and stuff as well. And you'll see recurrent themes in terms of the destructive power of capitalism and colonialism and how they've destroyed communities, languages, environment, and left many communities on their knees in many respects. So, but in spite of all that, I think what's really interesting in terms of the question that Orly opened with around decolonisation, that minoritized languages and cultures, and I use the term minoritized deliberately, so we're not minority. There was a process by which we became the minority, but those minoritized communities continue to play a very significant part in many of the political disputes today. So in spite of everything that's happened, and no more so than in our own experience. I mean, we've had the experience of the last 5 years, just to give a very recent example, where the Dram Jarrah campaign and the question of the role of the Irish language in society became the dominant political question, even more so than Brexit for a certain period there, which was a huge political question, obviously, as you know, in the last 5 years. The question of rights for Irish speakers, the status of Irish language in society, became the dominant question. The joke that we like to say in the kind of Dram Jarrah stuff is, prior to 2017, we were very lucky to get an article in Town News. Within 6 months, it was New York Times and Washington Post and Reuters and Al Jazeera and all these global news networks were covering the issue. So the trajectory went up very, very quick because of a grassroots organised campaign and because of the organic crisis in the political system here in Ireland. And as I said, that's that's particularly true in terms of the role of minorities languages can have in terms of some of those political disputes. So this idea, and I know Arlene Foster asserted it, that the Irish language activists and the Irish language campaign were political activists. Yes, of course we were. That was the point. We never disputed that fact. And very much, I mean, and there's a guy, Adam Ramsey, who writes for Open Democracy website. And the way he described it at the time was, of course the Irish language is political. It's always political for marginalised minorities to express themselves. It's always political to defend diversity in the face of those who demand a monochrome society. And that's exactly what was happening. And I suppose simultaneously to that, in 2020, we saw the emergence, in a more general sense, we saw the emergence of protests that rocked the world around Black Lives Matter. And more people began questioning existing racist and colonial structures, the structures of white supremacy. We've seen statues being wrecked and removed, and it rekindled a kind of debate in the West around colonialism. So that debate was already well established in the global South, if you like, but in the West it was a no-go for many communities, and there was a general sense of awareness raised and consciousness building at that time, and solidarity with particularly black people in America, which was expressed then in protests that took place around the world. And the people in Ireland then began to reflect in terms of our own violent and oppressive history, and we drew parallels between our own history and the oppressive power structures that affect the everyday lives of black people in America and other minoritized groups around the world. But in spite of that, and even having this debate here around decolonisation, there's still a sense in many quarters that talking about decolonisation and even talking about colonialism is somehow controversial, that it's somehow beyond the pale, that it's outdated, that it alienates people, that it's a no-go area, and that to become embracing of all, then we need to get rid and we need to kind of move beyond the idea of decolonisation and the colonial impact in Ireland. But I mean, that's never been the case here, and I think, I mean, we only have to have a quick glance through our history. One of the major kind of events that took place at the end of the 19th century that kick-started the more general cultural revival at that time was when Douglas Dheachta, who went on to become the first president of Ireland, who was obviously one of the founding members of Conradh Ghaeilge, when he wrote his now famous essay, The Need to De-Anglicise Ireland. Like, Douglas Dheachta was by no means a radical. He was very much a centre of the ground liberal in many respects, but he obviously acknowledged the fact that Britain had perfected the compulsory Anglicisation in Ireland. That colonial process that they took around the world, Ireland was the first colony, and it drafted the kind of blueprint for the consequent models of language and colonialism practiced throughout the world. So we need to address that if we're going to overcome and emerge. Decolonisation isn't just about the material keystone of the country, it's about undoing the harm of the colonial process that happened. And then moving forward in 1916, obviously the Easter Rising that took place, but the undercurrent of that was the cultural revival that took place in the years preceding that. So, Padraig McPearse wasn't exaggerating when he said that when the Gaelic League was formed, the Irish Revolution began, because that kick-started a kind of question and more people embracing and actually individualising and at a community level going through this decolonial process and re-inhabiting this decolonised identity associated with the redevelopment of the national language. Partition obviously stalled that, with a conservative class in Ireland commandeering the revival, and it was stripped of its kind of emancipatory content, and it was taken over by the state itself in the interests of property classes, the landlord class, and everything else. But again, in spite of that, and I know that big Martin O'Kane is looking on us behind here, people like Martin O'Kane were still very much talking about this idea and talking in decolonial language. His famous mantra, well, famous among Irish speakers, is he Agol na Hurn, Slanny na Ghaeilge, is he Slanny na Ghaeilge, Agol na Hurn. So the reconquest of Ireland is the salvation of Irish, and the salvation of Irish is the reconquest of Ireland. So very much linking the question of national independence, national emancipation, with the revival of the language. And that, again, isn't something that should be deemed to be controversial in any way. So in terms of fast forward to where we are now at the minute with the campaign and with the question of rights for Irish speakers, I think in many respects where it could be construed as being kind of dangerous territory for us, the state obviously has passed the first piece of legislation in the history of the state in terms of affording official status to the language. And from our experience as activists, we've been in many ways helped by the intransigence and outright bigotry and hostility of the state to the language. That has been a defining motivating factor which encouraged so many thousands of people out into the streets. Every time Arlene Foster opened her mouth, an extra 1,000 people were turning up to a protest. More and more people were signing up for classes. So I think the question for us is, what do we do in the context where, on the face of it, the state is now becoming more amenable to the language? The state is happy to put some Irish up on signs, without actually changing the overall power structures that still minoritise Irish speakers. They won't be addressed, but on the face of it, the outright bigotry will be removed and be replaced by something which will present itself as being open to facilitating native culture and stuff. What do we do as a protest movement? What do we do in the face in the face of that type of different change and different tact from the state itself? I think there's lessons that we can gather. We want to obviously avoid what happened in the South and post-partition. Again, Martin O'Kane, the guy who the winter school is named after, he kind of explored this question, and the way he described it was in terms of the juxtaposition of what was happening in the South with what was happening in the North. From a language perspective, it's very interesting that within the one language community, within the one country, you have two completely different approaches here. And the way he described it was, in some ways, outright hostility is much better than pretend. So in the North, we had the outright hostility, which then engendered a reaction from below. Whereas in the South, they had a state government that was pretending to do something for the language, but wasn't actually doing anything for the language. But it done enough to nullify any opposition to their policies. So we want to avoid that. We can look towards places like Wales, where, in spite of the state bringing in strong legislation, they are consistently challenged from below, from Welsh language activists, consistently challenged to make things stronger. People aren't happy to sit back and let the state take control. They understand the power of activism on the ground and constantly trying to challenge the state and to go beyond what the state deems feasible at any particular time. Another more interesting model in the context of the debate that we're having this weekend would be in Catalonia as well, where again the language and the issue of national revival and cultural revival is very much linked with the whole idea of national independence, and that isn't done in any way that's kind of hidden. It's very much front and centre. And obviously, listen, I mean, I understand there's obviously limits in terms of drawing parallels with other jurisdictions. Circumstances are always different, but there is an interesting dynamic there. And I think, you know, when you speak to Catalan language activists, one of the reasons that they would give for this is very simple from a linguistic perspective. They say most certainly our view is that the language will be more secure if we have national independence. So where we are no longer subject to the whims of the Spanish state, because even though Catalan is by no means a minoritized language, I think there are 20 million speakers, but the Spanish state as such can still introduce repressive measures. So one of the things they did around 5 years ago was they introduced measures to limit the teaching of Catalan in schools, by which if one person in a class of 30 demanded to be educated through Spanish, the entire class had to be educated through Spanish. So stuff like this. So they're trying to break free. They're using the language as a way of breaking through that, and that's led then to, you can see, we've seen some of the protests that they've had in Catalonia leading right up to the votes that they held in self-determination, where there was like 400,000 people out onto the streets of Barcelona. They were led openly and ostensibly by language groups like Omnium. Their leader is actually still incarcerated for his participation in that. So they linked very much this idea of national independence with the revival of the language. So, and I think in terms of ourselves, there is, I think, because we are not immune from the broader conversations around the constitutional direction of the country here. And there is a question around, can the language only really flourish if it's part of a much deeper national revival? We're at a crossroads, as I said. I think the Dram Jarrag offers a kind of example. It's a participatory model, non-hierarchical, non-aligned politically, and it can help kickstart a more comprehensive revivalist movement in a more general sense in terms of what's happening here. Because we have seen, obviously, the debate around Ireland's future. I don't mean that in the sense of the organisation, I mean the future of the country more generally. We can see powerful lobby groups coming together, we can see powerful interests coming together, there's going to be decisions made. How much people in Ballymurphy get to participate in those conversations, is questionable at the minute unless we kind of provide the form. And I think, as I said, the likes of the Dram Jarrag and that model of organising from the below, of being ambitious, of bringing people together, and of actually challenging power structures is something that could be broadened out beyond the very specific question of language rights within the state. So just to finish up, I know, because Owen had organised this, and I know he's a big fan of Frantz Fanon. And Frantz Fanon, obviously, he argued that any effort to awaken national culture also means in the first place to fight for the liberation of the nation, the material keystone which makes the building of a culture possible. There is no other fight for culture which can develop apart from the popular struggle. So, Jim Chinnacarja, this is where Everson
For me, my Ciarán, bhí sin Harvey Scoil Gheimhridh just the wealth of knowledge that Ciarán has around this topic of, decolonisation, but really driving and working to get political activists and young people on the ground involved in their communities in many different levels and in many different ways. We're very lucky that we have an activist like Ciarán in a leadership role who's trying to pull that movement together with the Dram Jarrag, or whether it be with establishing youth clubs right across the north of Ireland, actually. He's been integral in moving the youth movement forward as well. I suppose thinking about political activists and how we can get our communities involved, even if you look at the model of Laochra Loughley, which is the standalone Irish language club, as most of you in here know, just getting all generations of a family together and making the language a living, breathing language of every day. So looking at the Múnla Síl Trí Gaelic a tuaing agus Cradam Goil agus Goil Bóthar Slán agin yes to do Slánan mar Flé Ciarán, but tá Síl Trí Gaeilge Uí agus tá sé go cinnte ribh Poisty Stogamsta leis an obair cean rudaíocht atá ag tarlaigh go háirithe a cantar seo san Uachtar Cléanaí so gur míle mai agad Ciarán. So just to try and get a different kind of perspective, and I was slagging Ciarán about being the oldest, I'm like, shoot, well, flip right over to maybe somebody that's the youngest on the panel and looking at what has that difference been. Ciarán, one of the first cohorts attending Manscoil First Year, Eimear attended it in a very different sense, where the Irish language was a bit more living and breathing around her. There was some structures put together that Eimear could participate in, like the Dram Jarrag or like a local youth club. I know that Eimear was born and reared here in Dermot Hill. She attended Bunscoil and Slavaghiv. She comes from a family that is sort of split. Like some people would have been totally fluent in the language. Other people in our family weren't and didn't attend Irish medium schools. So that's a powerful dynamic as well, to watch a young activist growing up attending Irish medium schools, not necessarily having that support at home all the time, which would be completely different to what Edel had, or even Ciarán. But just interested to know, Eimear, a wee bit about your journey and the things that got you involved in being politically active within the Irish language movement. Eimear is currently on her PGCE, and she's just finished a stint at Queen's as well, where she was part of the Common Gaelic, so we'll maybe hear a wee bit about that. So, far in the fáilte raibh, Eimear, and what does decolonisation mean for you?
Gur mé agad Orliath, agus Owen, agus Glór na Munas, and Mac Giolla Bhéin. For me, just a bit on what Ciarán said, like, you know, people talk about decolonising your mind, but here the colonial structures are very much in place. What we need to do is get rid of the structures, you know, get rid of the colonial structures. You know, it's not like some abstract thing in our mind, it's very, very real, and there's practical stuff that we can do to change it. And the Irish language, in the Irish case, is our means of doing that. You know, and when I went to university, the kind of decolonisation debate is very much going on, but it's more like in England they're taking down statues of slave owners, but for us it was actually putting up Irish language signs, and it was pushing the language to the fore. So we need to be very specific when we're talking about what we actually mean by decolonisation and how it's going to be relevant to the conditions in this country. So I don't think I ever consciously got involved in the Irish language movement or activism. You know, I don't even know if I would like call myself an activist. But it wasn't until I went to Queen's University, and there was, you know, obviously I went to college for first year too, and you're always faced with attacks by the DUP and whoever. But it was more like, you know, when the attack happened on the day, you were a wee bit angry and your teachers were telling you to write letters. So you were writing the letters to the DUP and the First Minister and whoever, but you weren't really realising how this was affecting you. You know, so it was kind of more of a natural route towards activism, and it wasn't until I got to Queen's and, you know, there was no adults in the room to do it for you, and there was a strong Irish language community there with the Common Gaelic. And Queen's obviously were completely opposed to the Irish language, and the attacks on the language were like ferocious there. So I didn't even realise that sort of community existed in Queen's before I even went. I was going, like, I'm going to study, that's it, I'll go home to my house in Dermot Hill and I'll forget about it. But when I went and actually seen how vibrant the community was there and how Díchoilíniú the activists were, that's kind of how I got involved. Now I was studying history and Irish, so I wasn't just faced with these attacks in the Irish department from management, but in the history department too. You know, you're sitting in lectures and they're telling you to, you know, see everything you think you know about history, just forget about it. See whatever opinion you have based on whatever experience you have. Just, you have to set it to the side. You're neutral here. You're objective. You're an objective historian. So see, like your granda being interned or your uncle being shot. Just forget about it. I can't dictate how you read history. So it was challenging. And you know, like naturally, I think just given how I grew up, you're going a wee bit like, you know what, fuck you. And like, I don't know, that's it. Like, I don't know how to read history any other way, you know. And that's the thing. I remember going to my mummy and she was like, but if they're marking you down for it, like, would you not just try and do what they're telling you to do? And I was like, but I don't actually understand that reading of history. Like, I don't understand it. And I suppose I was lucky enough to go to college the first year where they were like, fuck you too, you know what I mean? So that was kind of that. So you were getting it on both ends. And then that's when you start realising that my essays, what I'm doing is I'm challenging the colonial structure. When I'm writing them essays that are saying F you, I'm challenging the colonial structure. When I'm saying put them signs up, I'm challenging the colonial structure. So it became a really practical thing, and the language is an important means of doing that in this context. But also, the language can't be seen as something sort of abstract as the only way. You know, like I love speaking Irish, but like I love speaking Irish and I love the Irish community, but on its own, it's not enough. You know, you can have Irish language signs up in Queen's, and this is the kind of debate that our campaign for Irish language rights on campus brought about, is that you can have Irish language signs up in Queen's, but if you have an Irish language sign saying it's for a food bank, what the fuck's the point? You know what I mean? We want to change that too. And that's kind of what it started. We not only were talking about the language then, that we were talking about class. And for us, that's what Queen's University, we were able to expose in Queen's University, is that they're an imperial structure, that they're anti-working class and they're anti-Irish. And we've seen that mostly with our campaign for the Living Scheme, where the university not only were challenging us because of the Irish language, but they were challenging us because we were working class. You know, that was it. It's not that they hate the language, it's that they don't want to do anything for it, because why would they? They want to charge international students like thousands and thousands to get them in to make money. So why would they care about the wee working class kids on the doorstep? They're not making any profit. So it really, really started to expose that question. So like when we're talking about the language in Queen's, you have people who think that the language is just something abstract, something that you love and something that you speak, and people who want to be involved in the campaign because they want to see the revival of the Irish language as something sort of on its own. But it has to be placed within decolonising the island. And you know, again, we'll have to be specific when we talk about decolonisation. What decolonisation for what class? You know, we can have a united Ireland, an Irish-speaking island, but for what class? And that kind of needs to be the central question. Yeah.
So Haran Sparran is imagining a new Ireland with leaders like Eimear about to take it on and drive it forward. So Eimear Nic Ionnrachtaigh, my who.
I just talk shit.
What did I say? My who. A store. So obviously, if Eimear's currently on her PGCE, and she comes from a family of local political activists, and obviously that just doesn't stem from anywhere. You know, Eimear didn't just start creating these ideas and she went to Queen's University and felt like that she was being oppressed, or felt like she was being judged, or not accepted for what she wanted and what she believed in. So I suppose maybe a lesson we could take from Eimear is looking at how we are with our own children as well, and some of the values and stuff that we can help instill in them, to inspire them to become political activists within their own right. So my humour. So a very different perspective from Edel Ní Churraoin here. So Edel came to Belfast about 10 years ago. Yeah. So she's middle of the road old. She became involved very quickly on her arrival in Belfast with the activism that was going on within the Irish language movement. So Edel is a radio host, she is a film producer, she's a woman of many talents, she's a musician, she's an artist, she's a dancer, she travels around the world, she finds out about different people that are being colonialised around the world. So Edel brings a wealth of knowledge and experience with her when she is participating in those sort of structures such as the Dram Jarg. We're very grateful in Belfast that we have somebody like Edel here with us, working within the Irish language movement. But life was very different for Edel than it was for Ciarán, and very different than it was for Eimear, where Edel was born into a Gaeltacht area in Connemara in Galway. Now Ciarán talked about, when he was speaking, Ciarán talked about the South pretending at the card. I'd be interested to hear Edel's perspective around that, living and growing up in the Gaeltacht and going to a Gael Scoil and then travelling across the island to come to Belfast, where there was massive hostility, and was there differences in how that made Edel feel in everyday life. So like to just welcome Edel, and the question to you, the same, is, so what does decolonisation mean to you?
Well, when you talk about the differences and how the hostility here, it is kind of what Ciarán said, that the hostility here is more visible. Because growing up in a Gaeltacht area, people like to pretend that because there's a certain amount of state funding going there and because they've put a name on it as a place, that it's well supported, when in reality Gaeltacht areas are the most disadvantaged. If you look at any of the socioeconomic kind of things that are there, our illiteracy levels are higher than anywhere else on the island. Even things as basic as when we're looking at where internet service is available and is like quite good. The places where you can't get, and the lowest, I can't even remember the word in English, where there kind of is connectivity, are the Gaeltacht areas. So people like to pretend that decolonisation ended in the south, or that colonisation ended in the south with formation of a new state, when that didn't happen at all, and that the areas that are seen as the most kind of embarrassing to the state are, for the most part, Gaeltacht areas. And it took a civil rights movement in the 60s. While the civil rights movements were happening all over the world, one started in a Gaeltacht area with 10 people turning up at a meeting, and from that, a lot of the things which Irish speakers all over the island and all over the world that they use as the basis of things that have just always existed, like the radio and all of those things, came out of that civil rights movement. But they weren't, and this is the difference between Gaeltacht and other areas. At that time, Ghaeilge itself wasn't on their list of demands because it didn't need to be. Ghaeilge was the language that surrounded them. There was no issues with the language at that point in their small areas. But things that they were demanding were basic human rights, and you talk about like working class areas and the things that they need, but the 10 demands were things like housing, or they wanted a government for themselves, like a place where they could have control over those things. So a certain amount of that was given. So with like the Radio na Gaeltacht was started in 1972, Údarás na Gaeltacht, which for anyone who doesn't know is a organisation that is meant to be elected officials who decide on legislation for Gaeltacht areas. It's based on things that happen in other countries all over the world. And in reality, that organisation is a glorified business promotion agency who really are failing in the aims, or in the original reason why they are meant to be there. They're not doing that. They're not elected officials. They don't really support the areas that they're meant to be supporting, apart from a certain amount. They do quite well in the promotion of businesses, and it seems to me at the minute that they are really trying to promote the Gaeltacht as like a tourist attraction to Americans. And it seems like the Gaeltacht to many people is kind of like a safari that you go through, look at the locals, or we don't like to call people indigenous in Ireland for some reason, but the indigenous people living their backward lives. That, you know, and when I went to university that was the first time where you talked about coming up against hostility in Queens. As children, we did come up against hostility everywhere, but we didn't really notice. Like, I remember being on a bus into Galway and people laughing at the fact that we were speaking Irish. We'd go and play, like, the GAA is meant to be the, you know, one of the organisations that really does push decolonisation. We'd be playing camogie games against teams from the other side of Galway, and they'd be calling us all kinds of names. And absolutely, like, sledging on the pitch. All the sledging we got as kids was because we spoke Irish. And we were known as that bogger Irish speaking team. Like, that was the reality of the situation around us. And then people ask why we're embarrassed as teenagers, why Gaeltacht teenagers stopped speaking the language. It's to try and fit in. They're like teenagers everywhere else. And it's different here because people are brought up, people are brought up being told all the time that this is a special thing you have. I noticed it in the Gaelscoil. It's really nice to see, but it's like Tashib specialta, Tashib Eigsúiltán, Rucha Agi. We didn't have that at the time, and I think it's starting to come in that kids, they are sitting down with the younger generation and telling them this is something you have. But at the time, it was just a bit embarrassing. You'd be places and not have the words for things. So you kind of tried to hide it a bit. And then when I went to Dublin to UCD, you'd be actively told on nights out, go back to your home country, because people were so unaware of the Irish language and what it sounds like outside of the cities. So that, you know, the noises that are actual phonetics in Irish that everyone seems to have forgotten about, they'd hear them as foreign. So it was just this very strange pretense is what I find with, especially in the South. And it still exists, and you know, it's brilliant that thousands of teenagers go to the Gaeltacht every summer and have that experience. But it's about trying to make sure that everyone realises that these are real areas in which people live their lives, and that we kind of need two systems when it comes to the language, because sometimes when we're talking about decolonising and the Abheoch and the Ghaeilge and all of this, we kind of forget that there are communities that haven't had the same experience as everywhere else, and we kind of have to deal with them differently. Gaeltacht areas don't need an Abheoch because it never died. What they need is proper support and proper structures, and they need to be able to self-govern in a certain way. Like the Údaráis is a great idea that could feed perfectly into the more umbrella structures of Ireland. I mean, it does work in areas all over the world, but I think one of the things I find with Ireland is because everyone looks the same, and because there isn't such a clear difference. Because say I went to Colombia recently and went and visited some of the kind of indigenous populations, there's a very clear difference between the people who are from those indigenous populations and those who aren't. Whereas here in Ireland, I think it's the embarrassment that we should all have Irish that makes it very hard for people to deal with Gaeltacht areas and Irish-speaking communities on a level that doesn't come from that shame and defensiveness. So when we talk about the Irish language, the conversation automatically turns to it was badly taught in school, Peg's terrible, and just these arguments that we hear all of the time, when that's not the conversation we wanted to have in the first place. And I mean, the most obvious place where that is, you know, you can be in a taxi and just answer the phone in Irish, and then suddenly you get a lecture on how terrible the Irish language was for their childhood, and you're just like, what? I was just trying to talk to my dad, like, you know. So, and that's where we're coming from. So I think we need to like recognise that that's the level we're dealing with, and then look at how we can decolonise 4 different areas. Like, it doesn't need to be a one a one-pronged solution. There can be different ways of dealing with it, and I think, you know, the Gaeltacht is one of those areas. When it comes to the Irish language, it needs a different approach. But actually, when it comes to the other things that we talk about, like food banks and poverty and literacy and all of those things, actually, it's the same. So that's what I find. When I came here to Belfast, I found that there was a lot more similarities between where I'm from and here than there is between where I'm from and Dublin. And I think that's a conversation that needs to be had, because even when you're talking about United Ireland, often an argument you hear in the South is, but we're not really the same. They're different. And I'm like, yeah, well, actually, you're more different. And I think if we could have a conversation outside of the kind of media of Dublin, which seems to control the conversation that we're allowed to have, if we can kind of make that conversation a lot more widespread, that we'll see actually there are a lot more similarities between people from working class areas or from rural class areas, I don't know what you'd even call those, that we can see that we have a lot more similarities, actually that together everyone can, and like that's the most exciting thing about a United Ireland, is that it's a chance to fix a lot of things that went wrong with partition and with the foundation of a very, very, like an extremely religious state in the South. And it's a chance for both sides to take stock, both sides of the border to take stock and to say, can we move forward and do this better?
My head, Edel. So, Edel gur míle mai agat sin, that was so interesting. I was just trying to reflect, trying to bring up the contrast of maybe Edel growing up and probably the different journeys then travelled for the likes of myself, Ciarán and Eimear, or Edel coming from that indigenous, her own indigenous land and language. But she talked about going to school or going on a bus into Galway and being that weirdo. Well, you know, I'll tell my age now, so I'm 36, and when I was going to Scoil Phobal first year, 30 years, Jesus Christ, 30 years ago, I was that weirdo as well at the top of the weight track, and there was 4 families from the Upper Springfield, and the bus used to come from Ardoyne and pick up in the Falls Road and up the weight track and just grab headers, that's what you look like, all along, and brought them up the Shaw's Road, Gaeltacht, you know, so there is that to compare against, but in terms of feeling isolated, growing up when the language hadn't taken on the life that it has taken on, so I'm obviously delighted that it wasn't that same experience for Eimear, or maybe with Ciarán. Ciarán hadn't got any kind of social outlet. But in terms of learning together, I mean, it's just, it's fabulous that Edel is part of the language movement here in Belfast, and imagining a New Ireland and just taking on board some of the lessons Edel's family have, or some of the things Edel's family have had to endure, and that we'll listen, and we'll listen totally when we're imagining a New Ireland to people like Edel and her family. So gur míle mai agat, and I hope that has given everybody a bit of a perspective on, if we imagine a New Ireland with Irish, you know, how that would look like in 3 very different, interesting perspectives. So gur míle mai agat, gur míle mai agat Owen.
Question we could probably fit in 10. We've got somebody on Zoom with us as soon as we get 12, so hopefully in the next few minutes we'll start the next discussion on housing. But if there's a question or two, then we can go ahead.
I suppose one of the things that struck me this week was your woman Mary Kenny, and I know last night in the media, and the southern media in particular at the minute seem to be anybody who raises their head above the parapet, you know, they're sort of targeted or othered. And for her to come out with language like the English was bestowed on the people of this island, that, you know, we were given the gift of the language of Shakespeare. How frustrated does it make you feel when you hear things like that, you know, from people who have had a completely different upbringing and their rights were probably not as curtailed as what yours were, and they didn't have that aggression growing up that we have had. Does it get you angry? Does it make you frustrated when you see bullshit like that?
So stupid. It's very hard to even get your head around how you would sit down and write that article while living on the same island as the rest of us. It kind of baffles me, but it does show a tiny, it's not even Dublin. It's just this tiny part of Dublin, because even if you look at Dublin, like the problems in Dublin at the minute, it's actually really sad how tough life has got for certain communities, especially in inner city Dublin. But yeah, I mean, at this point for me, it's just another one of those people, because this is what we've kind of been, in a way, at least it's been written and she's open about it.
Yeah.
Because I feel like people have been saying those things and treating Irish language speakers like that for a long time.
Yeah.
But just it's never been kind of, it was always kind of secretive. But I
think it's rooted in the colonial experience of Ireland, and the same thing happens in other countries around the world that have been colonised, where this sense of internalized shame and then of being grateful for what's been bestowed to save us from ourselves, to save us from our own culture and stuff. And you know, people like Paulo Freire in Brazil, when someone was talking about South America, but you know, we talked about this idea that, you know, the colonisers constantly trying to make us walk like them, talk like them, dress like them. This idea that we need to imp our colonial masters to be acceptable or to find our place in the new modern world, and to reject what we came from and to embrace this new so-called modernity, which was brutally forced on us. So it's very much in keeping. But I mean, if you look at, like, for instance, Ireland prior to the cultural revival in the broadest sense in the late 19th century, that's where Ireland was at that point. I mean, lawn tennis was more popular than hurling in the late 19th century, until a cultural movement began with the formation of the GAA, and then with the formation of Conradh Gaeilge shortly after. And what we find is, when people are presented with a decolonising alternative to that, then they embrace it. The GAA became the fastest growing sporting organisation in the world. Conradh Gaeilge became the fastest growing social movement in Europe at the time. So people wanted this alternative, it's just it was never open to them. And the people like Mary Kenny and stuff, you know, are seeing an upsurge, I believe, in political activism in the South, of questioning those existing power structures, and are threatened by it. And they're constantly needing to, you know, revert back to these colonial tropes that, you know, somehow we should be grateful for what happened here.
And Irish is tied to the more, like the poorer areas of Ireland, but there seems to be confusion as to why that is.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of people seem to think that they are poor because they speak Irish, rather than seeing that the same reasons that Irish still exist there are the exact reasons why they are poor areas. And I think we've kind of forgotten that in the last 20 years or so, that kind of view of Irish has changed, maybe internationally, or because, you know, there are more Irish-speaking communities in places like Belfast, that it's not quite as tied in the national psyche as, you know, the peasant language. But that it hasn't really changed internally, and that there is an older generation that still see it as that way. So, like, I wouldn't have come through that as much as, say, like, my dad's generation, or even, you know, they were given English names just so that people wouldn't look down on them. And that's only one generation ago. You know, it's only now, in the last, you know, since I was younger, that Irish language names are a lot more common, or the more complicated Irish language names, rather than, you know, Maeve and Grania, the ones that everyone knows, that people have returned to, like the names from the Fianna and stuff like that. But that's very, very new. So, like, I think we can't forget that as well, that, you know, it always has been tied to that. You only need to look at the comics and all of the things that were written about the Irish language. So she's just putting that on paper, really.
Thank you.
Right.
Yep.
Thank you. Contributions were really brilliant there. The language is for me, someone who's not an Irish speaker, the language is the absolute key to building the island. It is the way that we're going to build. So just Republic of Ireland, the language is it's the only way. And like lots of as a non-Irish speaker, you carry lots of shame about not speaking the language. I'm very conscious of it and very aware of it. There's loads of people who are, but it is the key to building the Republic. I was watching college first during the week. 6 years had a match against last Al and tax furlough and went. I didn't realise that referees were all Irish teams. Is that like a thing? And they went, oh, yes, that's right. We're robbed. It was almost like an unconscious thing where the referee was robbing the guilders. You know what I mean? So like that's almost like that sense of that was come from deep-rooted psychological place in this referee who was robbing the fucking college first against last Al. You know what I mean? So there's a deep-rooted shame there that I think we need to use to politicise people, and the language is the absolute key. And Dram Jarrag is the model, because it's not only that it changed the macro political conversation, it's the fact that that macro political conversation changed because Growing and Mona was opening Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, cleaning young kids snappers and letting them go and play and speak Irish, and because that macro campaign was as a result of 30 years of just general work, supporting people, building them up, building their self-esteem, building their confidence, which then leads to that campaign. So Dram Jarrag is it. That is the model. There is no other model. It's this. And so I think, and the Guildboards in Belfast, I think, through the country are absolutely central to the reunification of Ireland and building Ireland.
Just building on what Mal said there about Guildboards being central, I think that I totally agree, and it comes out in some of the things that Palmer's saying. I agree with everyone's excellent panel. Been to a lot of panels about the Irish language in my life. Sometimes you hear a lot of the same things, but I think I was very enriching and lots of worthwhile stuff there. But it was off the back of what Edel was saying, and that there's more that kind of unites us than divides us. And it was actually a comment about the Yanks coming as tourism to kind of different fieldtop parts that kind of, I think it displays that in a lot of ways, not only in the fact of, not the point they're making there is that like there's a big effort to push Belfast as a tourist attraction, and that's a double-edged sword. And in a similar way, so not only are we a bit later down the path in that sense where the west of Ireland is being marketed by time as a tourist attraction, but in the context of what different people were talking about, the cultural revival of Johan, all this promise, all this excellent work, and a real sea change in Ireland in terms of language, and then some of that promise being lost, of course, after partition and all the rest. And I think it's very key for us then to kind of drill down into why that happened. And there's no one, I don't think there's one particular answer and whatever, but in terms of the Irish language and the Irish language movement, has been a key driver for that initial kind of independence movement for the cultural revival. Why then did that kind of fall back the way it did? And I think it's precisely that shift from an hostile state, hostile environment for the Irish language to, on the surface level, a safe place for the Irish language. And I think, obviously, we're not there in the north at all. You still have the DP, still have the Tory government, but we are in a context where signage is, and we're still a long way to go, but is at least that kind of is possible. You're not kind of hearing Campbell one talk back and be kind of mocked for the Irish language anymore. So there is progress, and I think we're at a crossroads in that. And I think we need to ensure, in some ways, that the lessons learned from the past, that the surface level stuff isn't enough. Because that's how you kind of decapitate the movement, that's how you hollow it out. Is you give all the surface level stuff and you leave the stuff underneath kind of thing. One of that's a very quick question for Edel, and we're just off kind of back this is more nexus and devices, like about where they think the potential is, or like whether university, did you notice like many of the Belfast people maybe being interested in Gaeltacht kind of questions, and vice versa for Gaeltacht communities, to what extent they've drawn from maybe John Jarrett and that type of stuff? Is there much of that? Is there potential for it? Or is there a long way to go on that? What do you think?
I think there definitely is potential. I don't think there is half enough overlap, and I think there is, but I don't know where you bring those people together, because right now, say there aren't an awful lot of people from the Gaeltacht areas coming to Queen's. You'd have some from Donegal, but then you don't have an awful lot of people from the north going to universities in the south. There'd be a certain amount in Dublin. So at the age where it's really important, they're not spending a lot of time together. But they definitely people are pulling from each other, and I think you see it like co-goals and whatnot that you attend, and people will ask about Undrum Darg, and they have an interest in that. But I suppose they're kind of taking some of the ideas and using them in our own ways. So like culturally, there's an awful lot, like a lot of teenagers from the Gaeltacht would be like learning music and song, and that's kind of our way of making sure that people know about their past and where they come from. But yeah, I think there is a lot of potential for a movement that would be similar, or like mirror, that could work together, but it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
Would be my
Yeah, no, I would agree, like, but there's definitely like lots of potential. You know, considering like Edel was talking about, you know, in the Gaeltacht their main issues are poverty and being underhoused and underfunded and whatever, and it's no coincidence that the Gaeltacht areas are the poorest areas, and it's no coincidence that the Irish Language Revival movement in the north is mostly located in working class areas. So yeah, it's realising how similar both struggles are, and you know, asking why is that happening in the south, because it's not in their class interest to fund the Gaeltacht, and similar here, it's not in the class interest to fund the Irish language or to push it, because English is the global language, it's the language of the market. So it's challenging them structures, and that's something we should be doing together, and that's why, you know, what's the type of Ireland we want, you know what I mean?
They don't want you to ask those questions, because the Gaeltacht areas are based on the reservations in America, and like nobody seems to want to actually, like, oh, it's almost embarrassing, I think, for people to say that now, but they went and saw those areas and came back, and it was pushed by actually people who were on the, like, trying to promote the language and whatnot. So I don't know why we can't have the conversation about why it was set up like that, and then maybe deal with why some of those issues exist. But when you start asking those questions, then they have to kind of maybe look, because I think that would be admitting that colonialism has had a massive impact on us, but they don't really, especially power structures, don't want you to start asking that.
I think just briefly as well, sorry, we had Yanis Varoufakis here last night, obviously, giving the keynote speech of the weekend, and he was talking about their own experience of social movements in Greece and how they led to Syriza getting into power and stuff, and then obviously those social movements were, as you described it, decapitated, and they were left with a sense of embitterment because of that process, because they had been, you know, they got this Syriza party to power, and then once in power, Syriza completely ditched them and failed to live up to any of their expectations at that time. And I think, I mean, if we look at how power, when it's threatened by people from below, always manages to co-opt a certain number of people or co-opt a certain number of their demands without addressing the underlying structures to satisfy just enough people to allow them then to go on and ignore the underlying issues. And I think that that's something that we always need to be concerned about. You know, the saying on the glider and stuff is nice, but that's not what we're about. You know what I mean? We want deeper change than just, you know, bilingual road signs or whatever else. And I think that we always need to remind ourselves that, you know, the power to address the issues that we have as Irish speakers, for instance, lies with Irish speakers themselves. We can't subcontract the power out to the state. We can't allow the state and say, right, go use and do this for ourselves. We have to do it ourselves. And that's the lesson that, you know, hopefully we'll continue to deliver on.
I suppose just in closing, picking up just a quick on what Niall was saying in terms of the opportunities that lies within the Irish language community and the links that, you know, working together with people that are obviously political activists, whether it comes to mental health or housing, or the environment or food banks or poverty. Do you know that we're all one, and imagining a new Ireland and working together is you know, this is the focal point, and it's just been it's been a pleasure to sit and listen to some of the speakers here today, and interesting and moving forward on how we build on this with the rest of the inputs in the room. So, Ghaeilge Mac, was there a question? Oh, come let's go. Yes, someone? Yep, no bother. So we're waiting.
We're going to get a couple of 5 minutes for people to get a wee coffee or anything here before
Dead on.
Off the cocktail.
Come back in about 5 minutes for the next part.
Didn't even consider a bigger one. You couldn't know
What? Excellent. Wait, this is good.
Excellent. Sorry, I persisted. Didn't get stuff for 5 minutes. That's us. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. You can just get me coffee and then come back up. So here it is, just looking as well, my accent I mean,
It's not the glorious.
why not? Okay, Dave, because no what? Since there's no, we don't have morning night, so it's going to go on the screen, but the sound might not come exactly from that laptop. That sound, so we'll just have the laptop here, speaker.